Invasive species cost the United States taxpayers more than $120 billion in damages every year, so it's a real problem. So tonight my talk is going to be the authentic garden. We're going to talk about some native plant myths, kind of poke fun at some things, all in good fun, about the native plants in the landscape, as well as touching on some traditional uses from indigenous culture for native plants. So I'll talk about us and how we started. This is our little nursery over here off of 53 behind Village Gardens, so please come give us a visit. We're a woman-owned native plant nursery. We only sell native plants. We strive to grow local eco-type plants from seed whenever possible, and we're committed to using environmentally and ecologically friendly farming practices. Our passion is really making native plants more accessible to the homeowners and increasing awareness and education surrounding native plants in the New England region. So we have our little garden center. You can see we're growing from seed. Right now we have about 18,000 little seedlings growing in our greenhouse. It's kind of crazy. We have a seed farm that we've started here in Norwell as well, trying to raise a whole bunch of very hyper-local plants to collect seed for. And we also do education. So we do garden consultations, presentations like tonight, as well as workshops. So what got me interested in native plants? I'm relatively new to the native plant world. Roughly 5 years ago, I had one of those light bulb moments. I had been a dental assistant for 18 years, and I got bored, so I decided to go back to school. I had heard Dr. Doug Tallamy's presentation, Bringing Nature Home, and that light bulb just kind of clicked for me. So I was a founding board member of Wild Ones, which is a national organization for native plants in the landscape, and we started the first chapter here in Massachusetts. And I discovered this really deep interest, and I realized that this is it for me. I'm not an expert, but I'm definitely passionate about sharing everything that I learn. So what are we doing today? Our goals are to debunk some of the myths and popular misconceptions around native plants, as well as discussing historical indigenous usage of plants. So what makes a plant native? These are a couple terms that we're going to talk about just to touch on things, get everybody on the same page. What makes a plant native? Why are native plants important? What's the difference between a native and non-native plant? And what makes a plant invasive? What makes a plant native? It's a very fluid definition for a lot of people, but basically over thousands of years, wild plants have grown naturally in any particular area. They've adapted to each region's unique environmental conditions. And over that period of time, the plants have developed very specialized relationships with wildlife also in that same area. So unlike very many non-native plants, native plants introduced into landscapes tend to be very hardy. They're less susceptible to pests and diseases, and they're unlikely to escape and become problematic. One of the things that defines native plants is where they grow. So ecoregions is something that we talk about a lot in the native plant community. It is something that does change, but it changes over like millennia. It's not something that changes very rapidly. There's far more to it than just temperature changes. Ecoregions are based on geology, landforms, soil composition, hydrology, wildlife, land use, all of those things together. So we've been accustomed to looking at growing zones, but what we really want to look at are these ecoregions. And you can see our ecoregion is the northeastern coastal. It's like that limeish green color towards the bottom right. And it stretches all the way down from roughly the top of Pennsylvania up to lower coast of Maine, and then kind of pretty much inland. So all of those areas, even though they span different growing zones, they still have enough in common with each other to be considered the same region. And if you really want to dig down into things, you can go all the way down to Massachusetts ecoregions. So you guys are right kind of on the line. We straddle the line between the Boston Basin, the northeastern coastal plain, and the southeast coast and islands, and just right in between the three of those. Why are native plants important? Going back to those specialized relationships, we want to talk about exactly how specialized these relationships have become. So roughly 90% of our native insects are specialized to 1 to 5 different species of plants. 20 to 45% of our native bee species are specialized to 1 to 5 different plants. And one of the best ways we can discuss host plants is using the monarch butterfly. Everybody's familiar with that one. So it's well known that the monarch butterfly requires the Asclepias species, which are milkweeds, in order to complete its life cycle. A host plant is one that supports the entirety of the life cycle of an insect, from egg to larva to adult. The adult monarchs lay their eggs on the milkweed plants. The larval hatch, and the caterpillars, which have evolved protections from the milky latex sap, feed on the milkweed leaves. So the flowers then provide nutritious nectar for the adult monarchs as well. And since the monarchs have pretty much put all of their evolutionary eggs in one basket, they've become solely dependent on the milkweed plants for survival. They can't get any nutrition from any other plants. As milkweed populations dropped throughout the last century, we saw that precipitous drop in the monarch population as well. So we've noticed that over the past couple years, there was a little bit of a bump in population, and then last year, the news was not very good. But hopefully by educating ourselves, educating others, planting more of these plants that need to be in the landscape, we can help keep these creatures around. So what's the difference between a native and a non-native plant? Depending on how broad of a brush we want to use, there's very many definitions really of native. Is it going to be native to North America? That's real broad. Native to the East Coast, native to New England, native to Massachusetts. So all of those have very different plants that would qualify as native. And there's a very good reason why you should aim for choosing plants that are as close to your specific region as well. Growing zones refer to the temperature changes in an area, what can grow in an area rather than what should grow in an area. So obviously this recently changed, and we're in zone 6. This is the old map. It shifted up a little bit, but this one works for our purposes. So zone 6, you can see, stretches all the way from Massachusetts down across the Great Plains and up into Washington State. And so what this means is that plants in that green, dark green zone technically could survive in all across the country there. The problem with that is the plants that are native to Washington not only are not native to Massachusetts, but they can actually be quite detrimental. So this is one example of that. If you drive up into Maine very soon, you'll see just acres and acres of fields of lupin plants, beautiful purple and pink plants. And the Mainers are very proud when those are in bloom because they call them their native lupin. Unfortunately, it's not the native lupin. These plants are the western lupin, which is Lupinus polyphyllus, instead of our native lupin, which is Lupinus perennis. And the problem is the Lupinus polyphyllus has come over here and it reseeds and it hybridizes our native plant very easily. So it just takes over and it's all either hybrids or Lupinus polyphyllus. The issue with that is we have one of these little guys. This is the Carner blue butterfly. It feeds solely on are native lupin, which is the Lupinus perennis. Only the caterpillars can only get their nutrition from Lupinus perennis. And so now that butterfly is functionally extinct. There's only a couple of very small patches where you can find that butterfly now. So that's why we can't grow necessarily just because it's North America. Yep. What kind of butterfly is that? That's the Carner blue butterfly. Mm-hmm. Yep.
How many miles does it take to get from that Carner blue butterfly, whatever you call it?
How many miles? Like where you can find it now? I know there's a couple of small patches up in, there's one patch in, I believe it's Concord, New Hampshire, and there's also a very small patch in Minnesota where it can be found in the wild. But other than that, it's pretty much extinct. Mm-hmm.
Well, when did it go extinct?
Very recently, within the past like 15 years. Because the Lupinus perennis, which is our native lupin in this area, has been hybridized by the non-native lupin, so it no longer gets enough of nutrition for it to survive. Okay. So what makes a plant invasive? The terms invasive and aggressive are not as interchangeable as you might think. A plant is deemed invasive if it is introduced, expands outside of the range of where it was originally introduced, and if it causes harm to the environment, the economy, or to humans. A plant would be aggressive if it just kind of fills in a space really quickly and maybe causes us a little bit of aggravation. Two very different things. Invasive species, this is outside of more than just plants, this is any kind of invasive species, cost the United States taxpayers more than $120 billion in damages every year, so it's a real problem. All right, so let's get into some fun native plant myths. The first one is a very popular one that went around the interwebs in the past couple of years. Native plants have deep roots and are drought tolerant. This is a very blanket statement. Drives me nuts to hear it, but it's not really an untrue statement, but it's not entirely factual either. So remember that whole ecoregion thing. Every plant is native somewhere, right? It doesn't matter where in the world it's grown. It's more of a physiological thing that makes the roots the way they are. Secondly, there's plants in every region of the world that have insane root systems. And the root systems don't just magically disappear or reappear based on whether or not they're native. And so many non-native plants also have deep root systems. One comes to mind is miscanthus. It's a giant grass that grows everywhere, and the root systems are crazy. So this is where native plants really do shine is when they're planted in the proper location for where they are. So this is just an example of, there we go. So with the root physiology, this would be a whole presentation in and of itself, but it has more to do with the species itself and the space where they're supposed to grow than where they're located geographically. Plants like taproots, rudbeckia and milkweeds, things like that, they have a long, strong root that grows straight into the ground. Those are prominent mostly in dicots, so more of like your flower type plants, versus fibrous roots like your grasses and sedges. Those are called monocots, and those have very like fibrous or net type of roots that grow really, really deep in the ground. Or you have the adventitious or stoloniferous roots, and those are the type like strawberries where they send out stolons to grow along the surface. So those stoloniferous plants are also native plants, but they have very shallow root systems. So just because they have shallow root systems doesn't necessarily make them not drought tolerant. The next native plant myth is native plants are foolproof and easy to grow. And if this were true, we would be out of business already. It's not so much that they're difficult, but it's more like sometimes they can be complicated. There's this human factor where we feel the need to control everything, and we're very also super impatient. So if we were able to just sow seeds in the fall and let them do their thing and be patient and wait for them to come up, this wouldn't be an issue at all. Additionally, some plants that we desperately want in our gardens simply aren't suited for these spaces at all. I'm thinking in particular our woodland orchids like lady slippers. Those require a very specific organisms in the soil in order to grow well. Other plants germinate just fine, like this is the lupin, our native lupin that I was just talking about. Germinates great, but it has that taproot that I was saying. So as soon as you try to move it into a bigger pot, it goes away. And then ferns, we have ferns growing in those little containers down the bottom. Those are especially challenging. Not impossible, just challenging. So thankfully, there's some pretty easy ways to grow a lot of plants. Winter sowing is great. Fall seed sowing, if you just throw seeds out into the ground in the fall, that's great too. And dividing mature plants are all really good ways to expand your garden. So when you're starting from seed, it's important to understand germination codes. These codes tell you how long seeds need to be stratified in order to promote germination. Both Wild Seed Project, so that's wildseedproject.org, and prairiemoon.com have really great explanations for germination codes. The winter sowing in milk jugs is a great way for beginners and experienced gardeners alike to grow a ton of plants. And again, Wild Seed Project has a really excellent explanation for winter sowing on their website as well. Native plant myth. Native plant gardens are weedy and messy looking. And I actually had trouble finding a picture for this slide because I love the look of native plant gardens, so I don't see them as messy looking. And every picture that came up when I Googled weedy yard was full of invasive species. I'm like, well, that doesn't work either. I think garden spaces are a lot like decorating your home. Everybody has different tastes. The difference is we're not typically showing our tastes to the general public like we do our yard. So you might be fully on board with the rewilding bandwagon, but your neighbors might think maybe you fell down and can't get up and mow your lawn. So let that lawn go to seed, and you might have a whole bunch of invasive species come up. That's what's in that seed bank in the top part of the soil. And it's going to take a long time if you just let it go before you have anything that resembles a real garden. So I think the root of this issue is really the lack of intention in these spaces. This picture down on the lower left, this was a pollinator garden in the front yard of someone's house in the Chicago area. And this poor woman put a lot of effort into her garden, but her neighbors all complained, and she was fined repeatedly by the city. And I think the real problem is that she has a lot of the same plant. So it all bloomed at the same time, it all went to seed at the same time, and then you're just left with a whole bunch of dormant stick-looking things, and it's not pleasing enough to the eye. But I have some more pictures of what I mean by defining a space. This is a highly maintained garden space. This is not for everyone. Plants are placed with color, height, and spacing in mind. There's clean edges and well-maintained walkways. Here we see plants thoughtfully chosen. These are all native plants, thoughtfully chosen to border the path, and nothing's overly tall or sprawling that you'd have to step over. The heights and colors draw your eye down the path without distracting from the rest of the landscape. And here we're starting to get a little more wild. I like it. We're using that trimmed pathway of lawn, which is really nice. Some natural borders, very soft edges. They're using lots of height and color repeats, and planting close together holds everything up so it's not all falling over. And here's the real difference. I like to call this one chaos with intention. You'll see, again, lots of color, lots of height differences. Everything's planted very close together, well-defined paths, but there's no room for like the mulch and everything else like that. The plants are doing the mulching. So when installing plants, you always want to keep in mind their fully mature size and space accordingly. So don't forget that most native plants thrive in massings, which means the same plants in big groups. That helps them hold each other up, and it creates a natural ground cover. And this spacing is especially important when you're installing shrubs and trees. You want to make sure you're paying attention to what it's going to end up being. We tend to put them much closer to structures and to each other than we should. And for most perennial plants, you can start off with roughly a one plant per square foot rule. Don't be afraid of using grasses and sedges in your design. Along with being very ecologically valuable, they provide ground cover when other plants are growing up, as well as kind of holding up taller plants that might flop over. It's also important when choosing plants to have a variety of bloom times. We don't want just like this big riot of color in June and then have it be green the rest of the time. Green's lovely, but it's not the most ideal. So it's also super important to have something blooming from very early spring all the way into late fall in order to best support our native bees. You can find bloom times on each of the plant pages on our website. Looks just kind of like that, so that you can space out your garden appropriately. Native plants attract pests. This is a big one. Nobody likes bugs on their plants. We're big proponents of creating habitat for insects and wildlife, but we understand humans have very complicated relationships with creatures that visit our gardens. We've been conditioned to see holes in plants and leaves as damage, and that insects on plants are a very bad thing. But the truth is that plants are the basis for the food web, and every single being on this planet needs plants to survive. Plants are food. So sometimes when we disrupt an area, even if it's in the name of building something beneficial like a native plant garden, we might create a little bit of an imbalance for a little while. So there may be more flying insects, more beetles, more caterpillars, which that would be a great thing. My best advice is to, if you see an imbalance of something, take a big step back, take a deep breath, and just wait a little while and see. I would bet that imbalance is going to balance itself out. So give it a little time. More birds are going to come to your yard to take the caterpillars off the plants. They're going to use them to feed their babies. Hummingbirds, dragonflies, and bats will come and eat on all the flying insects that you have going around. And just as plants are a valuable part of our food web, so are the insects that come to dine on them. So curious looking bugs that are crawling around on your plants. This little guy up in the middle left there, that is ladybug larva. So that pokey little guy is going to turn into a little ladybug, and they love aphids. So if you have aphids on your plants, I just recommend leaving them alone for a little while. Chances are pretty good you're going to get some ladybug larvae, and then ladybugs, they'll come and eat them all off for you. Dragonflies are wonderful creatures to have in your garden. They can eat hundreds of mosquitoes and other flying insects every day. Last year we had some beach plum at the nursery, and there were aphids all over it, and I was just getting ready to kind of squish them and rinse them off, and I decided to wait and see what happened. And it only took a couple of days, and we ended up having the ladybug larvae showing up and cleaned them all off, and the beach plums looked great afterwards. So less work for me. One of your garden goals in general might be to increase wildlife diversity across the board. The problem is we can't pick and choose which wildlife visits our garden, and oftentimes it's wildlife that we might consider to be pests. A big concern about planting grasses and tall perennials is creating a welcome habitat for what we would consider to be pest species, like mice or ticks. So in general, it does take a bit of a mind shift to when we talk about building habitat, But if you're choosing host plants to support butterflies and birds, you're creating perfect nesting grounds for mice. They just kind of go together. If you have mice, you're also supporting predatory species like owls, foxes, and hawks. So sometimes these new builds can get out of balance, but if we're taking the time and stepping back, put on your patience pants, and hopefully everything will balance out. This is a big one I hear almost every single day when we're open. I'm allergic to goldenrod. I hear it all the time. People don't want to grow one of our most ecologically valuable plants in their yard because they believe they are allergic to its pollen. And I'm not saying you can't be allergic to goldenrod, but I am saying it's pretty unlikely that goldenrod is the cause of your fall discomfort. The most likely culprit is another native plant. This is ragweed. Ragweed and goldenrod bloom at the same time, and they kind of look similar. I don't see it, but I guess they could be mistaken for each other. But it definitely grows in the same areas. So the biggest difference is in the pollen. Ragweed pollen is very light and fluffy, and it's dispersed by the wind. So it's flying all around and getting up your nose. Goldenrod pollen is heavy and very sticky. It's dispersed by sticking onto the bees that are moving from plant to plant. So if you are, in fact, allergic to goldenrods, it's probably because you're rubbing your face in it. So I recommend stop doing that. Another native plant myth, I suppose, is you need to fill your yard with 100% native plants, no lawn, or you hate our planet. Said very aggressively. And I get this because people get very excited about subjects that they're passionate about. That's okay. They want to share their passion with everyone, sometimes very loudly and persistently. The problem is we also don't like being told that we're wrong or that maybe we've been doing something wrong our whole lives. I've seen this happen time and time again on Facebook and internet forums. There's the 100%ers, and then there's the you can't make me's. My personal creed is I try to meet people where they are. I don't want to shame anyone. I don't want to make anyone feel bad. I know that there is what should be done and what is practical. Perfection always gets in the way of any progress, and it should never be our goal. So I think Maya Angelou said it best, when we know better, we do better. Native plant myth, I don't have enough space. And even the smallest spaces can have a big impact. We don't all have acres that we can turn into wildflower meadows, nor do we have the time or resources to do that. There's no such thing as too small a space to make a difference. An herb garden on a balcony, pots on a patio, window boxes, all of these have the potential to feed native insects. So I couldn't write a better blog post talking about container gardens. So I highly recommend giving this one a scan, checking out Wild Seed Projects again. This is an article they wrote about container gardens. They have a list of plants really well suited for containers, along with tips for planting and care. Native plants are low or no maintenance. I'm really guilty of this phrase when extolling the virtues of native plant gardens. But the truth is, when taking into account all of the aspects of planting a garden, right plant, right place, intensively planting, planting across seasons, yes, native plants can be lower maintenance. They require little to no fertilization. Oh, I wonder why that picture's all funky. No? Okay, well, sorry. Little to no watering, and they should be hardy to our area. So I think the main issue here is how we design our gardens, going back to that idea of how things are planted. This garden on the left is going to take some work. Those are all native plants. I don't know why it's all pixelated, but they are all native plants. They're just well spaced out, and they have a lot of mulch in between them. So it's most likely that it's going to need some irrigation during drier times, hotter times of the year. And you're going to have to do some weeding. You're going to have to pull out things that show up in between those plants that you don't necessarily like. The garden on the right, all these colors. This is my favorite picture. I can't wait to have a garden that looks like that. You have all of these colors. The weeds aren't finding their way to any soil. So you can just go in there and kind of putter around. So it's a lot less maintenance. The plants are making their own mulch. So they're shading the ground with their leaves, keeping it cooler and preventing water loss. Final native plant myth is no mow May. So speaking about meeting people where they are, I get where this idea is coming from. It was a good effort. We were trying to ease people into the idea of not needing a pristine lawn all the time, and giving insects and early springtime boosts. The problem with no mow May is that we aren't necessarily creating habitat. We're at best providing a very mediocre food source for a very short period of time. It's really unlikely that you're going to have anything exceptionally valuable growing. You're probably going to get a lot of dandelions, which they're not native and they're not actually bees' first food. You might get some fleabane, and you'll get a lot of grass growing to seed. Any habitat that you do create is, of course, going to be removed on June 1st when you haul out there and mow it all down. So I do like the idea of slow mow, which does have some scientific reasoning behind it, which I love. So either mowing in sections and allowing plants to grow through a cycle, or by mowing every 2 weeks, which helps keep weeds at bay, but it also allows flowers to grow. So another great option is to leave an entire patch of your lawn fully alone for the whole season. Mow around it all you want and let those weeds feed the bees. Take some water. So my next section is about plants native to New England and some of their historical use by indigenous peoples. And I just have a little bit of a caveat. Before I move on to this one, I just want to address a couple of things. I typically do not do land acknowledgements, and it's not because I don't believe they're not important. I think they're very important, but it's more because I found them to be mostly performative, and they were an easy way to make ourselves feel good. So many times they're stated at the beginning of a meeting, and then nothing is ever brought up again. So I've avoided doing those in the past, because I always felt I didn't know enough to make any statements, or that I would just be saying something I found on the internet and not have any real connection for me, or that I wasn't taking any concrete actions to make them go along with my words. So over the past few years, I've been trying to really put into the work of educating myself. For this next part, I'll be sharing information that I found compiled by multiple indigenous and scientific sources, and along with my own personal experiences. So it's my goal to spur some interest so that you start to or continue your educational journey. I highly recommend you seek out some opportunities to grow relationships with an indigenous community, to learn about their history and contemporary lives, and to share what you have learned in an effort to encourage those around you to do the same. So with that being said, I'd like to remind everyone that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Wampanoag, Massachusetts, and Pokanoket people, and I pay my respects to them, both past and present. My second little statement is a very important one. Don't take my word for any of this. I'm always very hesitant to provide any information regarding medical or edible usages for plants, for fear of putting anyone in danger. There's a lot of plants that look alike, and often when one plant is perfectly safe, the look-alike is quite harmful. So please do your own research. Never use anything that you're not 100% comfortable with, and never take any of this information at face value. So caveat emptor. Here we have a few plants that I chose with some really interesting information. Of course, I already talked about goldenrods. I think every yard needs to have some goldenrods in them. They're a perennial. They range from full to part sun. They are the host plants for not only the checker spot butterfly, but quite a few other butterflies. And they have a very late season nectar source. So indigenous peoples of the area used these flowers to produce a deep yellow dye for their clothing. And then the leaves and the flowers were used to treat various intestinal disorders. I'm going to be very vague about how things were used on purpose. Jewelweed is a wonderful plant. This is an annual for us. It is grows in part sun, average to moist. It has a lot of nectar for hummingbirds and long-tongued bees. You'll see lots of wildlife around these plants. This one is the juice from the stems is used to treat skin disorders. It has been scientifically verified as a potent fungicide. Maple species, I didn't specify which maple because we have lots of them. So this obviously is a tree, full to part sun, average to moist. It's an early source of nectar and pollen. We don't often think of trees as being valuable pollen sources, but they are. Food and habitat for many animals. Indigenous peoples used tea made from the inner bark layers to use it as an expectorant when they had colds and coughs, and to soothe those coughs. Bloodroot is a really cool spring ephemeral, so it only grows in the spring in the wooded areas. It is a perennial, grows in part sun to shade, mostly heavy on the shade, and average to moist soils. It has a really early pollen, like it should be blooming right around now, honestly, in the woods. And it's called bloodroot because the root underneath the soil has a bright, deep red color that will stain. So the dye was used in ceremonial face paints and to dye clothing. And the juice from the root was used in various ways to soothe sore throats, as a topical ointment to treat cuts, and as an emetic. Bunchberry is Cornus canadensis. This is a low-growing perennial, part to full shade. It really likes growing in very acidic soils, so under pine trees is where you'll find this one a lot, average to moist soil. Same thing, pollen and nectar source earlier in the season, and then lots of animals forage on the berries in the fall. The leaves were used as a poultice to stop bleeding, and tea was made in order to treat kidney ailments. Dogwood, we have quite a few different dogwoods. So the Cornus species, they are shrubs. They range from full sun to part shade, average to moist soils, pollen and nectar source, foraging in the fall, and nesting sites. They protect a lot of birds. You'll always get a lot of birds in your dogwoods. Tons of usage from dogwoods. So there was things made for eye medication. The bark was infused in water and used to help with aching muscles. They made a tea to induce sweating and to break fevers. The bark also makes dyes of different colors. You can get brown, red, yellow, and different colors of that. And then the wood is really valuable and used in a lot of carvings. Pipsissewa is Campophilia umbellata. This is a really dainty, cool flower that you'll find only like deep in the woods. It is a perennial, but it needs shade and also that very acidic woodland soil, early pollen and nectar source. And this one was cool. They use it to infuse it with water to heal blisters, which is not something that you read very often. The tea was used to break up kidney stones as well as to use for rinses for eye diseases. Sweet fern. This is one of my personal favorites, Comptonia peregrina. It is a small shrub, medium-sized shrub. Part sun to shade, can grow in straight sand, so very dry to average soils. It's the larval host plant for 49 species of butterfly and moths. So there's always lots of insect activity on there. Food source for birds and small mammals. The leaves make a tea. It smells absolutely lovely when you crush the leaves. They make an infusion to treat skin rashes, and I personally take the leaves when I find it in the woods. I crush them, kind of rub them on my neck, and it works as a really great bug repellent. Smells very nice. So here is a list of my resources. I especially recommend going to nativetech.org. Absolutely loaded with information, and as well as these papers that I used. But I highly recommend you going and talking and just learning as much as you can about our indigenous neighbors. So here we are at the end. We open for the season May 4th. We're going to have some vendors there. It's going to be a big event. So I highly recommend you come on down and see us. You're welcome. If you'd like to join our newsletter, we send out a few things every year, throughout the year, and you'd be entered to win a $25 gift card if you sign up. Thank you.